Hello there everyone and welcome. I am Jeff and this is Tabletop Toolbox, and on this 32nd episode of the Weekly Ratchet, I'll be taking you to the edge of infinity where no man has gone before or will go beyond, to Andromeda, because I agree, we are small enough now here on the Weekly Ratchet. That one was a little heavy, right? There was a little heat on that intro. In case you're wondering, the end of that was sort of an adaptation of a quote from Franklin Delano Roosevelt about the Andromeda Galaxy, and I did not know that the Andromeda Galaxy had been discovered that long ago. I kind of thought it was a recent discovery, but hey, whatever. Hey folks, welcome to the Weekly Ratchet. As always, I'm glad to have you here, and I hope you've all had a fantastic week of gaming with friends and or family. Not a whole lot of things to talk about here at the start of the episode. Lots of things going on, but nothing really too much. No more gardening, thankfully, as I've already got some poison sumac or poison ivy. I'm not sure from last week. This isn't too bad, but it's definitely been obnoxious. Hopefully it's on its way out here fairly soon. Other than that, I've got a unique segment at the end of this video. Make sure you check it out because it's going to involve all of you and this show and this channel. So make sure you stick around for that. For now, let's go ahead and check out the collection. Not a lot of stuff to talk about here this week, but I will mention this one actually came in, I think, a week or two ago. This is Snowfall Over Mountains. This is a pencil first game. I'll try and get a better photo of this so you guys can actually see it. The reason I got this, besides the fact that it is a cabin in the woods, is that this is a solo-only game, one player, 20 minutes, ages 14 and up, and it's a very simple tile placement game from the looks of it, trying to kind of complete routes and trying to get various animal tracks in certain combinations. It looks really, really simple, not even something that I would really get very excited about, but I thought this would be kind of neat to keep at our cabin in the woods, maybe just kind of downstairs in my little storage room, and I can play a little solo game at night, you know, when the rest of the family just kind of wants to sit and veg out or go to bed early, whatever, because I like to stay up late when we are at our cabin in the woods. Anyways, that's Snowfall Over Mountains. I also did finally get in, sorry, this is going to be noisy, the deluxe bits for Wormspan. I'm not sure if Missy still watches this, but these were the deluxe bits that the Dice Tower had in their copy of Wormspan. Little pieces of meat, little gems, and then little bottles of milk and little bars of gold. These things are just absolutely delightful. I know the camera's not going to focus on these, but yeah, this is a little milk bottle. One of the resources of the game, and yeah, we unboxed this at the Dice Tower East convention, and all of us were just kind of smitten with the resources. These are not cheap, but I just had to get them. So I got those in, and I also got, where'd it go? Right here, the Meeple Source upgraded components for the Obsession expansion, which hasn't shipped yet to folks. So these are some deluxe components. They were stupidly overpriced, and the only reason I almost had to get them because I have all the Meeple Source bits for the base game. But there's, you know, for those who don't know, Obsession is a sort of a worker placement tableau building game set in the, you know, Victorian era, sort of the Downington Abbey kind of era. It's funny when we use a movie as a reference of the time frame of a board game. Anyways, I don't know much about the expansion. It's kind of one of those that when it was announced, I just backed it. Obsession was one of those games that as a theme, not interesting to me at all. The first time I played it, I hated it, but I did like the mechanisms, and then we found out that the one part of it that I hated the most was actually taught incorrectly. It's still way too long of a game for like 4 or 5 players. I think it plays up to 5. I like it at 2, maybe 3. It's also a really good solo game. Anyway, so these are the deluxe bits for it, and I am looking forward to that coming out. I just think it's ironic that we got the bits before we got the expansion itself. Anyways, that's it for new acquisitions into the library, so let's go ahead and get to questions of the week. I keep saying library. I gotta stop saying library. Booting up the machine here. All right, so last week I asked you to give me your unpopular opinion, and I gotta be honest, folks, I'm a little disappointed because I expected a little bit more attention. I thought I was going to get some, you know, some rowdy stuff, some, oh, Terraforming Mars sucks or whatever. which is my unpopular opinion. But anyways, all these were fairly tame, which is fine. You know, I'm joking. In fact, a lot of this stuff was actually more insightful than what I expected. And I wouldn't say that these are unpopular opinions, as maybe just things that kind of go unsaid, maybe, in a lot of ways. But anyways, let's get to them. Simulation Chris said that he is not a fan of Ryan Laukatt's games, that Near and Far ended too soon, and Sleeping Gods was too clunky. And again, I don't think that's, you know, Ryan Laukatt's games are fairly popular, but he's not as lauded as, you know, folks like David Turczi or Vital Lacerda. Those are the games, if you speak out against them, people will just chew you up, and it's obnoxious. I get that. I, too, avoided Sleeping Gods. I just heard that it was too clunky, especially in the fact that I normally play at lower player counts, and you still have to use all the characters. That just felt like too much to manage. I have heard that the new version, I can't remember the name of it, but the sort of sequel of the game is supposed to streamline it a bit more. Maybe something you might want to check out. But of course, you know, as you kind of mentioned, you don't want to delve into those games anymore, and I can't argue with that at all. I still haven't played the Perilous Peril sort of micro game, small version game that you can get from like Barnes & Noble and such. I haven't checked that one out yet. Need to do that. Anyways, Yukon Zach said that he uses and enjoys Tabletop Simulator, that most folks say it's too fiddly or doesn't adhere to the rules of the game and takes money away from publishers, but he doesn't agree, and I, sir, agree with you. I think that Tabletop Simulator is a fantastic resource for both gaming hobbyists and publishers, designers, etc. In fact, one of the last ever episodes that I did of Board Game Breakfast out on the Dice Tower, you can actually see that video on the channel here, and I talked about Tabletop Simulator and the advantages that it played. Of course, programs like that and Board Game Arena and Tabletopia, and there's probably a few others, just exploded in popularity over COVID, which is around the time that I started to get into them, although I was using Tabletop Simulator beforehand. But then I think what people started to realize was that, well, hey, you can prototype games on it, and you don't have to you don't have to produce anything. You don't have to make a deck of cards and make all these components and try and send them out for people to preview or look at, whatever. You can just, hey, let's go and play on Tabletop Simulator, and then I can still kind of walk you through the game. We can even play around the game and, you know, help folks get familiar with it. I do agree that it's not a perfect experience. I do agree that it can be a little slower to work with, and for me personally, it's a little difficult to kind of keep track of and manage everything that's going on in the game. You can't as easily just look at the board, look at my player board, maybe look at your player board, and just kind of, you know, survey what's going on the table without scrolling all over the place and trying to see what's on the table. However, I've used it to play Dinogenics with the designer. I use it to play Wormwood with the designer. I use it to look at you know, games that were out on Kickstarter to see if I wanted to then back that Kickstarter. And that is huge. It's hugely beneficial, again, for me as a hobbyist and for those publishers to be able to, you know, communicate aspects of the game with me, a reviewer, while we're, you know, not quite face to face, but we're talking to each other. It's insurmountable as to how useful it is for folks. So I agree with you completely. Love Tabletop Simulator. Kay shared a list of fairly popular games that she didn't get along with, but then illustrated a bigger issue with the hobby in which people will blame gamers of being inexperienced or misunderstanding a game as a reason for not liking it, instead of accepting that not all games are for everyone. And Kay, this is something that you've mentioned before, and I agreed with you then, I still agree with you now. The unpopular opinion, I don't think, is necessarily about not liking those games. It's about the fact that we have to accept that games aren't for everyone, right? We have to accept that not everyone is going to like every game, and that doesn't mean that they're stupid, and it doesn't mean that we turn around and we insult them for not liking a game. You just kind of go, oh, well, okay, you didn't like that. Here's 17,000 other games that maybe you'll like instead, right? And look for ways to help each other. You can certainly say, well, what didn't you like about it? Oh, well, maybe you got that rule wrong, or did you try this strategy? You know, whatever. But again, just accept that not everything is for everyone, right? And that's going to come up here again in a little bit. Good to see you, by the way, Kay. Glad to have you back. CR Poll said that just because a game is sold mass market in stores like Walmart or Target doesn't mean it's a bad game or not worthy of real gamers. CR Poll, this is also something that you've mentioned in the past, and I agree with you as well. Now, I'm still not in the Monopoly camp, and that'll come up here in a moment, but I'm not one to say, no, that game sucks, you shouldn't be playing it. That game has a fascinating history, and I'm also one of few people who have played that game the right way, right? A lot of people have just all these generations of house rules that have just muddied up that game to the point that it sucks even more than it can suck on its own. I'll put it that way. Because there's always jokes about, even when you play Monopoly right, it makes enemies, which was kind of the idea of the game if you learn about its history. But anyways, I certainly agree with you. I've gotten some great games from Target. You can buy Meadow at Target. Meadow is fantastic. So I agree with you completely. Wonderflonium said the best token holders for gaming are silicone baking cups, and nothing surpasses them. In my notes here it says, well, I used to go to a gaming event on Tuesdays in town when I lived a little closer to town, and someone would always bring baking cups. That's what they used. And they worked great. No arguments about that at all. The only thing, and this is very pedantic, but I found that if you're playing a very beige Euro game, Obsession, great example of a very Euro colored game, and then you've got these bright silicone green and pink and yellow molds, and you're trying to get a picture of the game, they can just kind of be a little jarring. But that's a 21st century issue for sure. I will still say that I prefer a nicely organized and custom made component holder, something that kind of puts everything that game needs in one place. You can pass it around, you can stick it in the middle of the table, everyone can reach it. It takes up a lot less space that way. That's still my go-to, but I certainly can agree that the silicone baking cups are a pretty nice table hack for sure. Wayne Kruger suggested that the game of Heat by Days of Wonder is a bit overhyped, that it's a decent game, but suffers from a runaway leader problem like most racing games. Dang it, Wayne, I agree with this one too. I felt that this game was so overhyped when it came out. It has almost immediately just kind of vanished. I mean, that hype lasted for a few months, a few weeks longer than maybe it should have, and it has kind of vanished, even with the expansion that came out, which I have over here. I haven't touched it, haven't played it. It didn't really rekindle that much at all. I saw a couple of social media posts, and that was really about it. I'll say this, and this is kind of a philosophical point maybe, but I think all racing kind of has a runaway leader problem. If you think about the fact that the guy in front doesn't have to pass anybody and doesn't really have any obstructions in his way, kind of has a clear view of what's coming up, maybe a little easier for him than everyone else, although they can draft, I guess. There's that. But I do agree. I don't think it's a great game. I really didn't like the fact that it boils down or even just eliminates most of racing tactics. So there's no idea of apexing corners. There's no idea of drafting. There's a very, very little bit that if you end the space behind someone, you can then possibly get around them. And that's fine, but the idea of taking corners at an optimal speed, that's kind of nice, and that is the biggest challenge or puzzle of the entire game. Other than that, it's just a card game, and I think it's very subject to luck and randomness, because unlike real racing, there is no way to incorporate skill into a racing game or any sports game, really. You cannot have a player that is better than everyone else because they simply represent a better team, or they have a better engine, or they whatever, have the better car. Everyone's got to be on equal playing fields, and the only way to make that work is to introduce randomness in those types of games. And I think it's stupid, with the only exception being Vector Race. That is a board game I've mentioned before. It was in my top 100 on the Dice Tower. That is a racing game with virtually no luck whatsoever, with only a slight possibility that because it's kind of based on a grid system, you can play it on Board Game Arena if you want to check it out. But it uses a grid-based system, but you're placing out these cardboard kind of vectors to move your car in a certain direction, very much like X-Wing or TAC-Wing or whatever it's called, Star Wars. And you can kind of get a little off in alignment. You can get your vectors to kind of get a little funky, and that could give a player an edge, although it would be mostly unintentional, right? Anyways, so yeah, I'm with you on that one. Let me see, where was I? Rentless666 said that people care too much about rankings and scores. A game ranked 5.9 on BGG can still be a great game. I agree with this one too. And this is actually something I've talked about, and that I hate giving scores. In fact, this was a subject of the Ratchet several episodes ago, that I don't like giving scores on my Dice Tower reviews because I don't think a score means anything. My 10 can be your 2 and vice versa. And so I just try to tell you about the game and let you form your own opinions. But I agree with that. I will use it sometimes if I'm talking about a game that maybe I didn't really like, but it's got some high rankings out on BGG, and I'll just point that out. The Black Friday market game that I recently reviewed on the Dice Tower is one of those. I didn't really care for it, but it's fairly popular, and I just sort of pointed that out. Like, hey, you know, maybe take what I'm saying with a grain of salt because a lot of other folks seem to like it. And that's really kind of all I go with. Thomas Greaves said that there are some board game content creators that have too much power or influence over the hobby. This is a somewhat rarely shared sentiment, but it is not the first time I've heard it. And I don't think it's necessarily an unpopular opinion. It's maybe just one that a lot of folks haven't considered or maybe don't even know about. And I think that for folks who are a bit more immersed into the hobby than others, we may see some of that. I do tend to agree with you. Of course, not going to name any names or anything like that because I probably know some of those people. But, you know, sometimes that can kind of go both ways. Sometimes that can be a benefit. Sometimes it can be a hindrance. But I totally understand where you're coming from. Dan Cheston said a box is just a container and shared that he has no issue cutting up a game box to make it fit a game better. You, sir, are a monster. I'm just kidding, of course. I'm definitely on the opposite side of the spectrum from you. I don't cut up boxes. I really felt bad when I had to recycle all of my Everdell expansion boxes because the art of them is fantastic. What the hell am I going to do with, 6 boxes sitting around the house? But I get it, and I know that some folks who do that for the conservation of space. For me, it's kind of like if I have an expansion, like I've got the Star Trek Fleet Captains expansions, and those things are out of print. And so if I ever did decide to part ways with that game, I would be glad that I have all the original boxes, then I can kind of sell it as a complete set to a collector who would want that. And then, of course, whatever they do with it, I don't really care. But if it's, Heat, great example. I got that expansion, I unpacked it all into the base box, threw everything else away, because who needs it? It's not something I can never get again. And even if I couldn't, am I really going to care that much? So anyways, I'll let that one go. Jamie Wiley said that he likes Monopoly and often defends it against haters, but he's played Monopoly more in the past 50 years than any other game and has tons of memorable experiences with friends and family playing Monopoly. Yeah, exactly. On that topic, no argument here. Is Monopoly a good game? Maybe that's something that you could kind of debate. But I'm not going to ever say that, well, if you like Monopoly, you're an idiot, or you don't know how to play games, or whatever. I mean, you're absolutely right. You've got experiences a lot of folks don't have. My favorite story with Monopoly is that when my wife saw Ticket to Ride at the Toys R Us in Ohio back in 2017, I believe it was, and she said, "Oh, I've heard about this. We should get this." And I said, quote, "Do you not remember the great Monopoly fight from a bunch of years ago? Like, we got into a tiff over Monopoly. I do not remember what year it was. I really wish I had made note of that." She always played it on the computer, literally the original PlayStation. She had a Monopoly game for the PlayStation. She played it constantly and, had just learned its algorithm, its coding, and how it worked. Always played on easy mode. And so when her and I played, and she kind of did something that She tried a negotiation that always worked on the computer, and it didn't work on me. And we got into a fight about it. And that's my experience. That's my memory with Monopoly, right? So I get it. And again, no argument here. All right, that is question of the week. For next week, again, I'm going to cover that a little later here in the episode. So let's get to our feature of the week. All right, here we go. There is more than one game I played this week, but the one game in particular I played a lot this week, probably more so than any other game I've played, maybe even in a single week, period. I'm not really sure, but this was Andromeda's Edge, all right? And I played this 4 players just about a week ago. I then played it solo, and then I played it 2-player. I've got some thoughts on it. And because this is such a big game and there's so much here to kind of cover, and I don't want to bore you by just sort of sitting here and waving my hands around on the screen, so I decided to make it this week's feature game. And welcome to the Weekly Ratchet's featured game, this time featuring Andromeda's Edge here on the table. And in fact, you're looking at the conclusion of a two-player game between my wife and I. I was this blue faction, and she played as the white ships over here. A little bit of, Hail Penn State colors. Why not? So I'm going to show you a couple of the things here on the board. I'm actually going to mention some of these bigger pieces first and then get them out of the way. And then I'll show you some of the core basics of the game. Again, this is going to be very high level, just so that you can kind of understand where I'm coming from when I start to recap my playthroughs. So what I've got here are a couple of these raider ships, these sort of copper colored pieces. We have the Paralon Rifler over here. This is the Corrigan Smugglers. This is the Hive, a very nice looking piece that even has these small hornet little bees attached to them. The base game only comes with little cardboard standees, and given the fact that this hive covers the entire tile, I don't know that I'd be against some standees in this game. That thing was abnormally obnoxious sitting here on the table. Anyways, I've also got a number of the developments here. Here are two of the observatories. My wife had both of these built. I have a spaceport and an obelisk here on the board. So I'll go ahead and clear these out of the way as well. Now what you're looking at are the base tiles of the game, and I'll mention that these four were not at the start of the game. They were kind of revealed as the game went on. So we start with, I believe, 10 tiles for the two-player game. And what you're seeing is all the ones that feature a name are allied bases. These are locations you would go to trigger the text on the bottom and possibly retrieve these leaders. These are the only ones that were still left on the board by the end of the game. All the other tiles are planets. Now, planets don't really provide anything on their own. You would go there and collect a moon. Each planet comes out with 3 moons during the setup, and then as new ones come out, they get 3 moons. And if all the moons have been removed, then you would simply get the resource printed on the tile. Other than that, really the only purpose for the planets is to build these various developments. And again, they're sort of color-coded to the planet. So this was the yellow spaceport piece. And so this is your spaceport card. You see that it kind of lines up color-wise with the planet. Also here at the top, we have a number of these nebulas. These have more valuable moons that you can collect, but there's no actions to take there, except for looking at 2 of the event cards, which I'll cover in a moment, and picking one to stay on top. Other than that, you can also possibly come out and retrieve leaders. We've already picked up our leaders from the nebula, and typically there's only one ship that can actually go to the nebulas, and it is this very familiar looking twin nacelle style spaceship that can travel to the nebulas. I'm going to go ahead and show you the tracks next. So these are the 5 progress tracks of Andromeda's Edge, and you'll kind of notice right away that they start to correlate with the colors of the planets that you saw a moment ago. So again, here is that commerce track, and here is the spaceport, which would be built on the yellow planets. And when you build one of these, you would go up 1 space on the commerce track. You also have the, I believe it is the civilization track, the supremacy track, I believe this is the industry track, and the science track. And throughout the game, you're going to be building these modules on these 2 sides, as well as those developments to be able to progress up those tracks. There are also some other ways that you could progress up those tracks. Like, for example, if you get a token like this one, that simply tells you you can pick any 2 tracks to move up 1 space. As you advance up these tracks, the developments that you've built may become worth more points at the end of the game. You may also get some other benefits, like this one lets you build a ship upgrade on your player board. These exclamation points will advance the event track, which I'll cover in a moment. These 2 spaces will give you some points at endgame for the resources you have left. These 2 spaces will let you have more tactics cards in your hands, which are often very powerful cards that you can use throughout the game. These modules will sit on the side of your player board, and I think that's a good time to go ahead and jump over to those. So here we have a player board set up. This was my faction, the Jelluloid Technoblorps. I didn't come up with that on my own, folks. You can see I have a number of resources here. I have energy, ice, nanocarbons, titanium, and credits. These are also some excess leaders. These would eventually get placed into those development pieces. If you are using the deluxe components as the base retail version of the game, the developments are simply cardboard standees, and you just kind of discard your leaders in that case. A lot of stuff happening here in the board. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but here are where I would store my ships. So if I had ships waiting to launch, they would be sitting out here, and then they would get launched onto the main board. So on your turn, you're either deploying a ship out onto the main board, onto an allied tile where you take the action, or to a planet where you simply collect the moon. You may, of course, also trigger combat and more. But anyways, I have a couple of my ships upgraded. This is showing their movement, how close they can be deployed next to one of your existing ships. And then on the right, it shows you how many dice they roll when you're going into combat. I also have some special faction abilities down here in very small print. And then over here are all those modules I talked about. So again, science, industry, commerce, and population or civilization tiles all go here. Now the neatest part, I think, of this game is that, as I said, you take your turns playing ships out onto the main board. However, whenever you want, if you have at least one ship out on the board, or of course if you have all your ships out there, you can take a return to station action. And when you do that, you start bringing these ships back and placing them on these various modules to activate that module. So this one, for example, just gives me a single coin. Now, if I come up here to the primary reactor, it actually triggers this entire row. This is the only row in the game. You can kind of see that there's no dividers between the cards. So it will trigger that entire row. In this case, giving me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 energy, with another energy being supplied to any of my opponents. Also, myself and all my opponents would get a unit of ice, and I would get a coin. And that is, of course, if none of the modules are damaged, which are indicated with these little red pieces. That module would then get skipped in that activation, although I did have a special faction ability that said if I had at least 3 or less damaged modules, I could treat them as if they were undamaged, and that was pretty handy. Once you put your ships out onto these different tiles, and of course you can see how slippery and finicky these things can tend to get. But anyways, if I have put at least a ship on one row of my base over here, if I have at least one ship on a row, except for the top green row, which is unique, I can then use my energy cubes to trigger additional modules in that row. So as long as I have a ship here in the machine shop, I can trigger the shipwright, which would either let me build a ship or repair something, either a ship or a module that might be damaged. This one gives me a titanium, and if I triggered both of these, I would then get to take the benefit of the moon I slotted in between them, in this case giving me another repair action. If I also triggered this, for example, I would get the ice, I would get a point, and I would get a credit immediately at that time. And there's a bunch of different stuff here that you can trigger. This is honestly my favorite part of the game, because as you're pulling all your ships back, you're triggering all these things, hopefully all of them, getting a ton of resources, although there are limits. These you can only have 5 of each, and energy you can have 10 of each. You can store moons here, up to 4 of them, but you want to try and get them placed out in various parts of your station. And I'll mention this little spot over here. If you ever lose combat, you can either take a tactics card or a coin. And in fact, let me grab just a couple of tactics cards from the discard pile up here. These give you a wide variety of benefits throughout the game. The white ones can typically be played at any time. They'll tell you specifically when you can use them. The blue ones are diplomacy. They're used just before you go into combat. Each player gets a chance to play one of these, which may even just end in result in the combat completely. These have a specific name. I forgot what they're called, but you can also usually play them on very specific times. These also advance the event track. And then we have the red ones, which are usually used during combat. This one specifically says play when you lose a battle. So these are the tactics cards. You're usually limited to how many of these you can hold as well. And as I mentioned over there on the blue progress track, that lets you hold more of them. Just 2 other quick pieces I want to show you here are the scrapyard and the repair barge, and this is sort of the event track or event wheel. Whenever ships get destroyed in combat, they'll typically go to the scrapyard. You can then use a repair action to pull them down to the repair barge. They're still unavailable to you, but when you return ships to your station, you can return ships from the repair barge to activate those modules I just showed you. But if they're in the scrapyard, you'll still get them back at the end of your turn, and they'll be ready to launch out onto the main board, but you cannot use them to trigger any modules on your station. This here is the event track. You can probably barely tell, but there's actually some cards sitting here, and every time that you trigger one of those exclamation events, you saw them over there on the progress tracks. There's also just a couple tiles that when you visit on the main board, they will trigger. Some of the tactics cards trigger them, etc. You'll move this little token around this track, and when you land at this last space, you'll then reveal another planet for the map. So for example here, this would give me one of those city maps one of the supremacy maps, etc., or planets, I should say, and then you'll reveal the top card of this deck. And this is going to tell you that every player is going to score for their position on the civilization track, minus a point for each damaged module. This is telling you right here that the Sea Raider will be triggered in the game. He will be spawned out into wherever he would go. You'll reveal his card, reveal his miniature standee, etc. And then down here is some special effects that each player would get. In this case, it says each player gains an ice, and then you would put an ice on the newly placed planet, whichever one just came out, and every adjacent region. And anywhere where you have a ship on your turn where there's a resource, you can just kind of hoover up that resource. I'm going to go back to the main board for a quick second and very, very quickly mention combat. Okay, I've kind of set up a quick scenario here just so I can demonstrate how combat works in Andromeda's Edge. So let's say that it is my turn and I decide that I'm going to deploy a transport here to the shipyard. This will let me either build a ship or repair a ship or module over on my station or over on the scrapyard as I just demonstrated. The first thing that's going to happen after I activate the effect of that tile is that this pirate, the Paralon Rifler, is going to move over here. He has a range of 2. I was only 1 tile away, so he's going to come over here and give me some grief. At that moment then, it sort of opens up this open broadcast that any other players or other ships within range of that tile can join in on the fight. So since my wife is sitting down here at the Maximus field, which is not a tile that her transport can give her any further benefit, she decides, sure, why not? She's going to come hang out here and participate in the fight. I have these 2 significant ships up here. This is my Dawn Glimmer and my Proto Seeker, the heavy cruiser, and my science vessel. And I decide that I will, of course, bring them into the fight as well. Now we're going to look at the abilities of all of our ships. My wife's transport can only roll 1 die, and she very luckily rolls a 6. I, however, get to roll a total of 7 dice, 3 for each of my ships and 1 for this ship. However, the maximum you can ever roll is 6 dice. And let's just say this is what I rolled here. The Paralon Rifler, per his card, gets to roll 4 dice, and let's say this is what he rolls. So in this instance, my wife and I both have a 6. The highest die from the Raider is a 5. So our 6s sort of cancel each other out, and his entire roll is canceled because he doesn't have a 6 or, of course, higher. So these 2 dice sort of go away. Now we resolve the next highest die, which I have no one else at play. Since the Raider has already been eliminated and my wife didn't roll another die, I would then win with this setup. Now I would also get to typically re-roll these 2 1s because I have actually the 1s and the 2s, because I have 3 ships in the fight. So my targeting is a 3, which means any number lower than my targeting level, which is a maximum of 5, would let me re-roll those dice. So I could potentially re-roll all of these and get some extra values to work with. That would not be too bad. That's just kind of a quick summary of how combat works in Andromeda's Edge. Let's head back to the table. So that was a very high-level recap of the experience of Andromeda's Edge. It was so difficult for me to kind of pare that down into those few minutes. There is so much stuff that I left out, and even realized when I was done that, oh, I forgot to mention this, I forgot to mention that, and I just can't cover it all without making this a full-length review. I'm also not going to do this with this coffin-sized box sitting here the whole time. So I'm going to kind of recap the 3 plays I had of this, and I'm going to try to refrain from, referencing too many base rules and such of the game. I'm hoping that that recap was kind of enough to at least give you an idea of what I'm talking about when I talk about some of these components or rules or whatever. So I've also got myself a little notes here, so I'm going to bring this in the screen just a little bit. So I played this a week ago at 4 players. I had Mark, who I mentioned last week. He's the owner, one of the owners of the Unplugged store, and my friends Mike and Matt. And Matt is, as I mentioned before, he is a hardcore gamer. Very, very just talented gamer. I very rarely ever win against him, and usually when he wins, it's with a considerable margin, and this was definitely one of those cases. So I went into this game expecting to lose it. I was not expecting to be something like 70 points behind him in this game. And the reason for that is a couple things. First of all, we played it at 4 players. So in a 4-player game, you have a lot of extra tiles out on the board. I think you actually have as many tiles as I showed in that image at the end of the 2-player game. You would start with that setup. And the only thing you can do at the very beginning of the game, you may have a couple of resources. You may be able to actually trigger one of those allied bases and kind of do something. And a couple players did. They went and converted some basic resources into coins, which are a wild resource, as I think I covered. Or maybe they went somewhere and picked up a couple extra tactics cards or something. But knowing that collecting these moons off those planets were kind of useful, I placed myself into a planet and I grabbed a moon. I thought this would be good because I figured I'm going to lose a lot of fights. I might as well kind of bolster that one part of my board that gives me something when I lose a fight. And then my next action, I went and I grabbed another moon. Well, then all of a sudden, other players were already going and building modules. They were building new ships. They were triggering all these extra things. And I looked at the board and I realized that I was at least 2 spaces away from any of the bases to let me do anything. I was sort of out, on the outskirts of the galaxy, if you will, away from any of those action spaces. And I couldn't even get to them without first using a turn to pick everything back up, except that I had a player power that actually gave me a slight benefit if I had no ships left to launch at the start of my turn. So I was incentivized to get all my ships out, which means I spent my first 3 actions just putting out a ship and grabbing a moon. That was all I did for 3 turns. And at the end of my first 3 turns, I had a couple of moons, and everyone else had some modules already. They had some ships. There had already been a fight or 2 that had gone on. Some of them had already started going up the tracks, and I had done nothing. Now, that's an experience thing, and I get that. Like, playing the game now, I would certainly make sure that I did not run into that mistake. But I also could not shake the feeling for the rest of the game that I had lost it on my very first turn. I had put my ship somewhere where I could not possibly do anything of use for those first 3 turns, because you only start off with 3 ships, right? So there was that. Second of all are the faction powers that I've talked about a little bit in that video. And I mentioned that I had the faction power that if I had 3 or less damaged modules, I could pretend that they were not damaged. In the first play of this, I had a faction ability, as I kind of already mentioned. If I had no ships out there, I could kind of pick an unoccupied allied base, which that's kind of hard to do in a 4-player game, to have a base that doesn't have something sitting on it, and I could trigger the effect of that if I could afford to do so, which of course at the beginning of the game I could barely do anyways. But that was something that I could do every couple of turns. If I had gotten all my ships out on the board, boom, my faction ability would kick off. In the last game that I played with that player power of undamaged modules, that would work for me best when I was pulling my ships back, which again only happens maybe 3 or 4 turns in an entire game. Now, my good buddy Matt, he had a faction ability in that first game where if he got into any fight and he lost, he got to go up that central supremacy track on that main board. That's the tallest track, has the most spaces, they're all worth 20 points at the end, except for that he could trigger that off not only on any one of his own turns, but potentially any other turn from any other player. If they placed a ship next to him, he could voluntarily bring a single weak ship into that combat, intending to lose and bump up that track, which meant very easily he maxed out that track before any of us got to the top of any other track. I mean, none of us maxed out a track except for him anyways. And there are some tokens you can grab along that track. They are quite powerful, and he got every single one of them. And so all the other faction abilities that I've looked at have things that kind of trigger when a very specific thing happens. My wife had one that when she finished an entire column of those colored modules, she could spend some resources to buy 1 extra module. She still had to be able to afford it, right? And in Matt's case, if he had lost all of his ships in combat, it then may be difficult for him to do a return to station action and trigger off modules if everything was in that scrapyard. And so I kind of get that, and he was careful in how he used that at the beginning of the game to make sure he didn't get into too many combats, but still not that hard to get into maybe 1 fight every couple of turns, lose it on purpose, and just skyrocket up that track. So I really felt like, even on that first play, that something was off with that particular player power. And actually when we played at 2-player over the weekend, my wife drew that one randomly, and I actually wanted her to try it because I wanted to see if it would work for as well for her as it did for Matt, and she didn't want to pick it. So there was that. There's also something, and actually I'm gonna reorganize my list here. There are these tactics cards. I mentioned the tactics cards, and they can just be very, very different. They can be very diametrically opposed. Matt had a card fairly early in the game that said he could play the card to just end the fight, end any combat, and go up the supremacy track. An advantage he didn't really need, let's be honest, but if I could use it, I would have. Sure, it made sense. I drew a card later in the game that said you could end the fight, but I had to pay an energy to every player around the table. So that was a good and a good for him, and it was a good but a bad for me. And it's kind of like, why aren't these at least somewhat equal? I mean, I realize that maybe, you know, you don't want to just have the same card over and over and over again, although there is a ton of cards in that game. But it just felt like, I mean, literally, this is a card, I don't want to play this. There's no reason I want to play this. I don't even care about the ability because the cost is way too high. So it was just trash at that point. Now, luckily, you can use those cards as a wild resource, which I completely forgot about in the first game anyways. So there was that. And it wasn't the only time. I've seen a couple of these cards where just like, this thing is just so lackluster in what it does, and yet someone else just played a card that is awesome. God, I really wish I had that card. That'd have been great. So that was weird. But then there's one other thing I'm going to talk about, and I have tried to come up with a name for this, and so far I've failed. I've got something. It's a work in progress, folks. I'm calling this the ABCs, the aggressive besetting of contradictions. Like I said, it's a work in progress. The idea being that this game has a book of rules, all right? It's got a rule book. It's not a very good rule book in the fact that it leaves a lot of unanswered questions. And also, this is your picture of contents. Does this make any damn sense whatsoever? Like, if you're trying to see, you know, what is a type of card, and it only shows you like 2 of them, and you don't know, and if you've got different cards with the same back, but the fronts look different, like, you just can't make anything out of any of this. I hated this contents. But it also just left a ton of unanswered questions. There were a lot of fringe cases that just aren't covered here. And one in particular that I had to go digging out on BGG. I was also talking to my friends from the Meeple Society about this. There's a symbol in the game that says you can spend any resource. Some of the modules may cost 1 energy and 1 anything. The game makes it kind of clear that credits can only be used as a wild for those 3 resources. I think I mentioned that in my recap. Energy is not one of those resources that a coin can be used for, but can an energy be in any resource? Because it's very abundant. It's very easy to come by a lot of energy. You can get a lot of that off of that power reactor at the top module of your board. And so it almost seemed unfair to be able to use it as an any resource because it was so abundant. Like, who cares? I'll spend another energy. I got 10 of them. Who cares? But it is usable. It's actually confirmed by the designers out on BGG. And there was nothing in here that clarified that. And when you've got someone like that, you got a whole bunch of resources, and, well, can I just use one of these? And you're like, well, God, I really want to say no because it sure seems awfully unfair or unbalanced or whatever, but I can't find the answer. It's so frustrating. But on top of all this, all right, you got a rule book, again, tells you more or less, kind of, sort of, how to play the game. But then you have a faction mat that says, well, these rules for you are different. And then you build a ship upgrade, and that one says, well, for this ship, the rules are different. And then you have a raider card that comes out. We had a card that said, as long as this raider is present in the galaxy, all of your development costs are reduced by 1 resource. That's like beneficial to other players, which didn't make any sense to me at all. Why would a raider actually make things better for us? I don't know. Played the game twice with that raider in the game, forgot almost every time to use that benefit, because it's a card sometimes sitting across the table that changes the rules. And then when you get the modules change the rules, and some tokens on the tracks may change the rules. The tactics cards change the rules. And so you're sitting there, you're an hour and a half into the game, you've kind of just finally started to grasp the basic concepts of the game, but now all this stuff comes out that starts changing those rules while you're still trying to figure out the game even to begin with. And it just becomes such a just complicated experience. And you're sitting there a turn or 2 or a round or 2 later going, oh crap, I forgot about this, or I forgot I could do this, or we forgot to trigger this thing, or we forgot to move that event thing. And you cannot walk it all back because so many things change from turn to turn to turn that there's just no way to go, well, I guess we're gonna just forget about it. It's whatever, we'll just all kind of lose that benefit. And I then played this game solo. I had the exact same problem because the solo AI has his own set of rules. His interactions with combat are a bit different. He doesn't collect any resources. He just gets tactic cards. He never spends anything. Everything is free, which means that you can't really predict. You can look at something and say, well, gosh, I really want to go over here and buy that. Can anyone else buy it before I can? No, no one can do it, so I can hold off one more turn to get it done. Well, against an AI that everything is free, you can't do that. The AI, some of his cards will change things, and even then I wasn't quite sure on what rules changed for him and what didn't. You still had, of course, the raiders that changed things, and so that was a game where not only am I trying to play my game, but now I got to try and play the AI's game, and it triggers off of a sort of a deck of cards, and then again its own sort of core set of rules. So that was complicated. The other thing is that 2 players, the board is tighter, which means that you're a lot more inclined or a lot more likely to be attacked by the raiders. Because you've only got a couple of tiles out there, it's very easy to move somewhere or to place somewhere that is within range of the raiders. And I had a raider in that solo game that anytime you lost a fight against him and he rolled like 5 dice, he would destroy one of your modules or damage one of your modules. And I didn't have the faction ability to let me deal with that. And so I was trying to avoid that raider, or at least try to come in there with enough guns I could take him out. I did finally kill the thing, but oh my goodness, that was a hell of a fight. And so, 2-player with solo wasn't great. 4-player with all these sort of different levels of what people could do didn't seem great. I did finally, over the weekend, I played it 2-player with my wife, and it was actually kind of her idea. She was like, hey, look, I know you've been struggling with this game. I don't know if you want to do a review of it or something, but, maybe we can play it at 2 and, you just get a little bit more experience with it. So we did, and that was actually my favorite game of it, because at least by then I was starting to kind of grasp all the different things that you could do. For example, I mentioned that you can spend energy to activate those modules on your base. In my very first game of it, I did not remember that until the end of the game. I had cost myself a ton of resources, a ton of things I didn't get to do throughout the game. I had a ton of energy. I could have done it. I just didn't. So that was obnoxious. And so by this 3rd play, it was starting to make sense. We still had a very tight play space. I did actually kind of go in there and custom pick the raiders I wanted to play against, because it's my game and I'll do whatever I want. Also, there was a lot less downtime, although there was still a lot of downtime, especially for my wife, because, as in she had to wait for me, because I was starting to trigger sort of the bigger turns, except for it wasn't necessarily things I was doing on purpose. It was, okay, well, I'm going to play this card that lets me do this real quick, maybe giving me an extra action. Then I'm going to play this card, which sets something up. Then I'm going to go ahead and play my actual turn. But then that moves me up this track. That gives me this ability. I'm going to do this real quick. But then that moved the event tracker. Now I got to reveal the event card. I got to put out the next raider. I got to put out the next planet, the next set of moons. 6 or 7 minutes have gone by. I don't even remember whose turn it was, because those last couple of things I did could happen on anyone's turn. And I was like, well, hang on, was it you or that me? She was like, oh, no, it was definitely you, because I've been sitting here waiting forever, which was fair. I couldn't dispute against that at all. So there was less downtime, and it was a little bit more of a relaxing game. It wasn't as crowded. We did still have to deal with the raiders from time to time, and had, she kind of got in some fights she didn't want to end up getting into. I did have some lucky rolls. In fact, I won a fight with just 2 ships, and I rolled 2 6s, and I was very, very happy about that. In general, though, this game is very, very swingy, and I tell you what, it's really frustrating for me, and I know I've beaten this game into the ground already, but Rock Hard 1977, one of my favorite games so far of the year, is sort of a Euro game, but with a little bit of dice chucking and randomized cards, and it can be a little bit of a swingy experience. I don't ever think that the game is working really hard against you, especially not against one player. It's kind of swinging against everybody almost equally, except for maybe that candy rolling dice, whatever. This is a game where you can just get completely sacked in a single turn because you just had a crappy roll against a raider, and you're going to lose all your stuff. You're going to damage a module of your station or lose something or whatever. And it just sucks. It just sucks. There's nothing you can do about it. It's only you. It's going to be a you problem and no one else, potentially. And you're going to sit there and just go, well, shit, there goes my next 3 turns. I'm not going to be able to do anything now. And you're trying to scramble and come up with a workaround. And the next people are just taking their turn. Like, hey, it sucks, buddy. And yet this game is so unbelievably overhyped right now. It could be, oh, this is the most amazing thing ever. I don't really think it is. You've got these, I've got, of course, deluxe pieces. I mentioned this little hive piece in my video, and I thought this was really neat until these stupid things keep falling off. Like, this is what is making the game so popular. It's overproduced. It's got a toy factor. I've got one of the developments sitting here. Sorry, there are a lot of small pieces. This is the city. I've actually never gotten to build one of these things because they've hardly ever come out in the games that I've played. But you snap the ship in the bottom, and then you get to plug all your little leaders into this, and it's a cute little gimmick. It's cute and it's fun. It's got a huge toy factor. But this doesn't make a good game. It doesn't. All of us who grew up in that Lego era, and still are in it today, are going to see this and go, oh my God, I can't wait to play with this stuff. And I get it, except for that when everything around it is just this stupid random luck fest, is it really a good game, or are you just sort of pushing this as the reason to love the game? The iconography is terrible. You've got, for example, you've got these dice symbols. So I'm sitting here playing with it. You've got these dice symbols on your ships that represent how much dice you get to use in attack. And yet, in our first game, someone drew a module that had a little die on top. And so what's the die for? And I was like, well, it looks like the combat die. I'm guessing it gives you an extra die in combat. No, it's an entirely separate rule that we had to dig through the appendix to try and find, which I'll get to that in a second. But it said, well, that on that particular card, you have to roll a die, and depending on what you roll, you either get one resource or you get two of that resource, but then the module becomes damaged. It like overheats and blows up or whatever. It's like, oh, well, that would have been nice to like actually cover in the rule book somewhere, except for I think it was actually one of the sort of mini expansion content that the game came with. So you had to go through the appendix. Every card in the game has a number. The appendix does not reference any of those numbers. So there's nothing that you can kind of go to and say, okay, well, I got card 522, and here's 522. Or at least here's 510 through 530, and all the cards kind of work like this. There's none of that. And it was like, well, then why is this even on the cards? Why did you bother putting this through the print run when you don't have the book that supports it, and we can't use it, we can't find what we're looking for? This is garbage. I already talked about the rule book. And then the last thing that I'll gripe about, and I've seen this already online, is the end game is just kind of weird. When you trigger the end game, which is just how many points you want to play to, you can set the game at any length you want. It recommends 50, and then there's 60 or 70. It says if you're playing a 5-player game, you should, I think, pretty much default to 70, because when you're putting these things out, I kind of mentioned in the video, I think I mentioned in the video, if not, I meant to, that when you play one of these, you score for every leader that's on it and every leader on every adjacent tile, which in a 4-player or 5-player game, there could be a ton of those leaders sitting on those tiles that people haven't picked up yet. And so you place one of these things, bam, 10 points. In a 2-player game or the solo game, there might be 1 or 2 on the neighboring tiles. And so you put one of these things down, you get 3 points. And it's just, it makes for a longer game if you're playing to one of those higher goals. It makes it longer than even if you had set the same limit for more players, if that makes sense. What the hell was I getting at with that? Oh, so the person who hits the end game trigger, they will get 1 more turn. So everyone gets 1 more turn, including them, which means you do not get an equal number of turns. Basically, if the first player of the game triggers the end, they will get 1 extra turn at the end of the game that no one else gets. I don't have a huge problem with it, only because, again, in the only 4-player game I had, there was no way I was going to pick up 70 points on my last turn. It did not matter to me. Matt was trying to find a way to pick up another 20 points in that game. I was like, do you really need it, man? Do you really need it? But anyways, but a lot of people have griped about that already. And then there was one other thing I was going to say, and I got, the part that kind of irked me off about all this was that I posted my thoughts out on the Dice Tower. You can still go and see that if you'd like. I'm surprised it didn't get taken down. And I said, hey, I played my game for the first time, and I really just did a couple things that bugged me about it. These are the things I didn't really like about it. And of course, I knew I was going to get it, but I got it worse than I expected. Just be set upon by people saying, you can't possibly have an opinion of a game after 1 play. You can't possibly question this or that after 1 play. You got to play it 5, 10, 20 more times before you can even form an opinion. And that is bullshit. That is the dumbest thing I've ever seen, and I'm so tired of that argument. I remember the first time I rented a car. I was so excited to rent a car, I didn't think anything about that car. I had a shiny new car I was driving, and I was cloud nine. Now I'm 45 years old. I rented a car a couple of months ago, going on a family trip. It was a Volkswagen, and we hated it. Within the first 5 hours of driving this thing down to Georgia, this thing's a piece of junk. It beeps at us constantly. The sun visor is mesh, and so we're inside the car baking. The seat controls don't make any sense. The rear camera is crap. We had all these complaints about this car, and we were driving it for the first time. We are a species that makes opinions on things. The whole saying, don't judge a book by its cover, is because we like to judge a book by its fucking cover. That's what we do, right? And so to have this mindset that, well, when it comes to board games, no, you can't do that. You gotta wait. You gotta hold off on that entire fight or flight response that makes us critique things and play it again and again and again until society thinks that you're able to then make a decision. It's just stupid, especially when the fact that then someone goes on and they review a game. Oh, I just played this and it was amazing. It was great. I loved it. Best game ever. I can't wait to play it again. No one ever says, no, hang on a second. You got to play it at least 5 more times before you can actually like it. It's just stupid. Stupid. Anyways, that's my thoughts on Andromeda's Edge. The thing is, I don't think it is a bad game. I do enjoy the game. I love the module system, especially. The swinginess of the dice combat just drives me crazy. The swinginess of the tactics cards is kind of dumb. Sometimes you feel like you're just going fish through that deck to try and find something to kind of give you an edge. I don't really care for that. I don't think, though, that module aspect really makes up for everything with me. Personally, I think Voidfall is a better game, and Voidfall has all of its problems that I talked about on the Dice Tower. It's still set up on the table behind me, Andromeda's Edge, and I'm a little afraid to pack it up because I'm afraid that if I do, I'll never play it again. I think it's just going to sit there. I've thought about making it my first review of the channel. I'll talk about that in a moment. But anyways, I'm still just not quite sure on Andromeda's Edge. Moving on. The next game we played over the weekend was Big Top. This is a game from All Play. I mentioned this one when I got it through a math trade. I thought it was a different game, but I thought, well, hey, I should at least try this. We took it to our favorite little brewery, Center of the Universe here in town, and I was reading the rulebook on the way there, and I realized it is a bidding game, and I was like, oh crap, because it's also a 3 and up player count, 3 to 4 actually. I had to play 3 to 4 players specifically, which means I had to play with my daughter, who has never played a bidding game. And so I kind of took a different tactic. I basically tried to kind of teach her how bidding works by just doing it. But of course, my wife was there, and she's used to more thorough teaches, and so she had a lot of questions, which was fair. And so we got through it, and what was really kind of funny is that at first I could just tell my wife did not like this at all. My daughter was kind of ho-hum on it through the whole thing. She was okay with it. She liked it, but wasn't thrilled with it. However, the game ends because you take a game end card, you shuffle it with the last 4 cards of the deck, and then whenever you draw it, the game just ends. By the time my wife she drew that card, and she goes, well, what's this mean? I said, oh, that just means the game is over. And she goes, nah, I don't like that. She stuck it on the bottom of the next 4 cards and forced us to play 4 more rounds, which I was really surprised by. She had really kind of gotten into it by that point. I did win this, but the scores were very tight. I had 71, my daughter had 66, and my wife had 62, so I was really proud of my kiddo for that one. The premise of this game is kind of weird. You have these kind of attraction cards. Here is a acrobat. I'll kind of show this as best as I can through the shrink wrap. You can kind of see it's got some numbers there in the bottom. So you put this out, you always have one card that's out for bid. Players are bidding on it. But if you bid a number that is either on that card or an unfinished card that is in front of your little wallet that kind of hides your money, you can then take either one of your dollars to cover up that number on the card in front of you, or take a coin from the bank to cover up the spot that's on the central card. So again, this card has a 4 and a 6 and an 8 and a 9. So if I say, okay, we're going to bid on this, I'm going to start the bidding at 4, well, I can go ahead and cover up that 4. If then I manage to win the card with presumably a higher number, I would then scooch the card in front of me. Let's say it only has the 9 left. Let's say that I bid 8, someone else had bid 6, and the card was mostly covered, and I won it at 8, I can then in a later bid, later turn, I can say, well, I'm going to bid 9 on whatever card's out there now, cover this 9 with a coin that's in my supply, and that finishes the card. Once the card is covered, all the numbers are covered, you immediately take all the coins off of it, you put them behind your screen, you put the card off to the side with a token on it to keep track of all your finished cards, and then these are just worth points at the end of the game. Some of them also have a star in the corner. Whoever has the most stars will get some extra points. Here's a couple other little, there's like these clown cards that can give you extra scoring based on how many of something else you may have. So the weird thing is that, like, we started to kind of understand the system a little too late in the game, and that what you basically want to do is when you're starting the bid, first of all, whoever is the current auctioneer, whoever is putting up that card for bid, gets the money that that card earns. So if I manage to auction this card off for 15 bucks, I get the $15. But if I win the bid, my $15 go to the bank, which meant that as we were often trying to bid on our own cards, we ended up the game with almost no money. I think I had $5. My daughter had maybe 10 bucks. And I think my wife had like 2 left. And the bank was rich. So what you really got to do is try not to win the card when you are the auctioneer, unless it is something you absolutely need for something. But then the other thing is that when you're doing that, when you're trying not to win the card, don't call off the numbers that are on the card, because then you're putting money from the bank onto it that eventually helps the person who ends up with the card. And so that was really interesting. Once I kind of started to figure that out, I was like, okay, this is a neat puzzle, and I appreciate what it's trying to do. It didn't come as quickly to my wife, and it didn't come to my daughter at all, but we did all like it, and I do suspect that it will show up at a brewery again here at some point. That was Big Top by All Play. The last thing that I played last night was Formspan. And I played it solo with my fancy new shiny bits because my wife didn't really care for this game that much. Just, you know, her first play wasn't stellar on it. I really enjoyed it, and I wanted to play with my new shiny bits. And so I played this solo, and I had a really good time with it. As opposed to the Andromeda's Edge solo, this thing does have its own rule set, but it is a much more streamlined rule set. The AI plays completely different from how you play, and all you do is reveal a card. You might put a coin out, you might move a little marker around that guild track, maybe it gets a couple cards or fills a line on that guild card, and that's it. Most of the time, the AI's turns are 5 seconds, and you can just kind of get right back to what you're doing. And I really, really enjoyed that. For me, it gave me that itch, you know, that sort of brain itch that I really enjoy. I was trying to puzzle my way through the game. I didn't really have to worry about my downtime. I didn't really have to worry too much about what the AI was doing. I won, but not by that much. It wasn't my highest score, which is purely on me because the AI doesn't really affect the game length or affect the scoring of myself in any way, really. So it was a really, really good experience. And that is going to take me to question of the week again. Okay, so it's been a long day. I want to talk about question of the week. So here's the thing. The Weekly Ratchet is not really doing what I wanted it to do. In fact, the last episode got viewed about as many times as the first episode. Now, I've had a couple of episodes that did really well with views. The Dice Tower Retreat one, way high. But I can't keep doing that, right? I can't do a 2-hour video every week about 30-something games when I play the same game 3 times in a friggin' week. So I don't know what to do about that. The other thing is that the channel is growing, and I'm having a lot of fun growing the channel. The Dinogenics video has been awesome. If you've watched that, thank you so much. If you've commented on it, thank you as well. And if you're going to check out the game, I mean, that's awesome. Obviously, you know, it's a promotional content video, so, you know, the idea is to get people to go check out the game, but also understand that I told you that game was really good, and I meant it. I absolutely love that game, but I'm curious to know if any folks actually backed it, whether or not it's because of my video. I'd just be curious to know. So that video did well. I did a top 10 last week. I don't know if you saw that. I had a lot of fun doing that. I've got ideas for some more on that in a second. But what I'm trying to figure out is what to do next with the channel. I'm not necessarily getting rid of the Ratchet, but again, it hasn't been growing. I'm not getting more views out of it. They're not really getting any subscribers, maybe 1 or 2 a week that it adds, which is going to take me forever to get the next 63 or so that I need to hit Lucky 1000. The top 10, that was good. The Kickstarter previews, granted, they can't all be as big as the Dinogenics one. I've got the Ultimate Voyage one that I've mentioned here. I can't dress up in costume like an ancient Chinese admiral. For one thing, that would be terribly racist probably in some way, and I just don't want to go there. Not to mention the costume for that would be insanely expensive or custom made, and I don't have time and money to do either of those. Anyways, so not every video can be like Dinogenics, right? I'd love for them to be, trust me. Maybe someday I'm going to have to add a costume budget to my review videos. I don't know, but I'm trying to figure out what to do next. So several episodes ago, I asked you, what did you want out of the Weekly Ratchet? And the Ratchet has gotten to a place that, I mean, I like what the show does. I like my notes. I like the sequence. I think everything works pretty well. People seem pretty happy with it. Again, it's just not really expanding. I've got a lot of new commenters. We're kind of like cycles, right? A lot of the folks who were commenting on episode 1 have kind of vanished. I wish they'd come back. You know, I'm kind of bummed about that, but we got new people commenting today. The numbers there kind of stay consistent, but the viewership overall is not really climbing. So what I'm trying to figure out to do is, what's the next thing for Tabletop Toolbox? I can't get into playthrough videos. For one thing, they take a ton of work, and they're really kind of boring, and not a lot of people watch them. I'd like to get into reviews. I'm still trying to do reviews for the Dice Tower because I send a little bit of money over. It kind of helps me with my Kickstarter addiction, right? But top 10s are kind of fun, but some are more popular than others. Like I said, reviews will be good. Kickstarter previews are good when I can get that kind of set up. That takes a little bit of legwork on my part. I got to get people to send me prototypes. I had a company reach out. I think I mentioned this last week, maybe, that a company reached out with, well, we're launching a game this week. Can you get a video put together? And I'm like, no, I can't do anything meaningful or good quality content in a week, especially with no copy of the game. And they just never wrote me back. I've got another one that's allegedly coming. I haven't heard anything super recently. Anyways, so I have to kind of do the legwork for those. I'm trying to figure out what I can do on a somewhat recurring basis, whether it's reviews, whether it's some top 10s or something else. I also want to maybe do just a general topic video about this idea that you have to play a game 10 times before you can have an opinion about it, but that'll be another topic for another day. I've been working on, I actually have an idea for a top 10 2-player games, because my wife and I do a lot of 2-player gaming. Also working on a top 10 solo games. In fact, I think this next week is going to be, or this week, is going to be a week of all solo gaming, because I just don't feel like getting my ass kicked by my friends in a big space game this week. Play some solo stuff, maybe kind of relax a little bit. And also, all this is because for about the next 5 weeks, 6 weeks, that cabin out in Shenandoah is booked solid for the weekends. So we can't go out there. We want to, but we can't go out there. I got all my yard work done with the evidence to prove it. So I got some downtime. I got plenty of time that I can sit in front of a camera and put out some content, some time to write some scripts. I've got a couple in the works. So anyways, I've rambled on long enough, but I'm curious to know what kind of content you like to see, what kind of content maybe that I've made that you'd like to see more of, and where do you think this channel needs to go to get more attention from either you or your friends? I guess. I don't know. That's a terrible way of phrasing that question. Anyways, I want to grow the channel. I'd love to hit my 1,000 and beyond. I'm having a lot of fun doing this. I really like the audience that I've got. Got some great people watching this, and I appreciate all of you. I really do. And I just want to continue to grow it. If I can keep doing some stuff for the Dice Tower on the side to get me a couple of games every once in a while, that'd be great. But I'm not necessarily eager to grow my presence on the Dice Tower. I've tried that. It's not really what Tom wants, and that's fine. So I'm going to do it here. And I'd like you to help me, give me the right suggestions to make that happen. And that is the end of the Weekly Ratchet for this episode. There'll be more, I promise. Don't worry about it. Thank you everyone for commenting, for sticking around to this point if you have, and I will see all of you again very soon, at least next week, if not sooner or later. Cheers.